An ordinary grocery trip turns into an unforgettable showdown when a racist elderly woman tells Shaquille O'Neal to go back to Africa. What he says next doesn't just silence the room, it changes everything. The grocery store. Before continuing this story, let us know where are you watching from. Also subscribe the channel for daily upcoming stories like this. Let's begin the story. It was a sunny afternoon in a small suburban town. The local grocery store, known for its cozy atmosphere and friendly service, was filled with shoppers. People chatted by the fresh produce section, picked out snacks for the weekend, and exchanged neighborhood gossip. Shaquille O'Neal, the retired NBA legend, had quietly come to town for a charity event. Despite his enormous fame, Shaq was trying to blend in. Dressed in a casual hoodie and baseball cap, he hoped to grab a few snacks and head back to his hotel unnoticed. But standing at 7 feet tall, blending in was no easy task. As Shaq walked through the aisles, he picked out some chips and a bottle of water. A few curious glances were thrown his way, but nobody said anything. That was until Margaret entered the store. Margaret, a 78-year-old woman and longtime resident of the town, was a creature of habit. She came to the store every Thursday at 2 p.m. sharp. With short silver hair and a determined expression, she moved through the aisles with purpose. Though she wasn't cruel by nature, Margaret was a product of her upbringing. She had deep-seated biases that she'd never really examined. As Margaret reached the snack aisle, she noticed Shaq. Her heart began to race. To her, he looked intimidating, larger than life. Without even knowing who he was, she felt uneasy. Her mind raced with judgmental thoughts. Why do they always have to be so big and loud? They don't belong here. Shaq, unaware of Margaret's internal struggle, continued shopping. He grabbed a few more items and started heading toward the checkout. But Margaret wasn't done. She muttered under her breath, just loud enough for Shaq to hear, "You black, go back to Africa." The words hit Shaq like a cold slap. He froze in his tracks, slowly turning to face her. His expression was calm, but serious. He wasn't the type to explode in anger, but he couldn't ignore what he'd just heard. "Excuse me?" Shaq said, his deep voice steady but firm. Margaret crossed her arms. "You heard me. People like you don't belong here." For a moment the store went quiet. Shoppers nearby stopped what they were doing. Some turned their heads, trying to figure out what was happening. A few whispered nervously. Shaq took a deep breath. He was used to attention. He'd spent his life in the spotlight. But this kind of racism, so blunt and direct, was something he hadn't experienced in a long time. He decided to respond with dignity. "Ma'am," he said, meeting her gaze, "I was born in New Jersey. This is my home too." Margaret was taken aback by Shaq's calmness. Instead of apologizing, however, she doubled down. "I don't care where you're from," she said, her voice louder now. "You don't belong here." The tension in the store thickened. One of the cashiers, a young woman named Emma, looked up from the register with wide eyes. A few other shoppers exchanged glances, unsure of what to do. Shaq remained calm, though a part of him felt deeply hurt. "You don't even know me," he said. "Why would you say something like that?" Margaret's face flushed with anger, but before she could say more, Emma hurried over, trying to intervene. "Is everything okay here?" Emma asked nervously, glancing between the two. Shaq gave a small nod. "I'm fine." Margaret, however, wasn't done. She was embarrassed now, and her pride wouldn't let her back down. "They shouldn't be in our neighborhood," Margaret muttered again. Emma's eyes widened. "Mrs. Margaret, please." At that moment, another shopper, a young man named Jake, recognized Shaq. His eyes widened and he whispered to the person next to him, "Do you know who that is? That's Shaq, the basketball legend." The whisper spread quickly. More and more people realized who Shaq was. Some started taking out their phones to snap pictures. Others just stared in awe. Margaret, still fuming, hadn't noticed the shift around her, but when she saw the look on Emma's face, something told her that she'd made a terrible mistake. Emma stepped forward, trying to defuse the situation. "Mrs. Margaret," she said gently, "you should know. This man isn't just anyone. He's Shaquille O'Neal. He's done so much for people in this country." Margaret's eyes widened. "Shaq?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Shaq gave her a small nod. "Yes, ma'am. That's me." Margaret's face drained of color. The weight of her words hit her all at once. She had insulted someone who had spent his life inspiring millions. For the first time in a long while, Margaret felt ashamed, but she didn't know what to say. She just stood there, frozen, as the realization settled over her. The entire store seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. The store felt like it was holding its breath. Shoppers stood still, watching the scene unfold. Margaret's face was pale, and her lips trembled slightly. She couldn't believe she had just insulted Shaquille O'Neal, one of the most respected athletes in the world. Shaq stood silently for a moment, watching her. His towering frame was calm, but there was a quiet strength in his eyes. He wasn't here to humiliate her. He just wanted her to understand. Margaret tried to find the right words but failed. All that came out was, I didn't know." Shaq sighed deeply. "Why should it matter who I am? Would your words have been okay if I wasn't famous?" Margaret flinched as if the question had physically struck her. She hadn't thought that far. For years she had carried silent prejudices, ones she had never been forced to confront. "I'm sorry," she muttered, but her pride still held on. "I didn't mean it that way." Emma, the young cashier, watched nervously, unsure whether to intervene again. A small group of shoppers had gathered near the snack aisle, whispering to each other. Some pulled out their phones, but no one dared interrupt the tense moment. One shopper, a teenage boy, leaned over to his mom and said, "Mom, that's Shaq. He's like a legend." Margaret heard the comment. Her embarrassment deepened, but instead of softening, she felt a spark of defiance. "I don't know what everyone's so upset about," she mumbled. "I'm just saying what I've always believed." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "And what is that exactly?" Margaret opened her mouth but stopped. For the first time, she realized she didn't have an answer that sounded reasonable. Shaq stepped a little closer, but his tone remained gentle. "I'm not here to judge you, ma'am. We all have moments we regret. But words can hurt. You don't know me, and if you did, I think you'd see me differently." Margaret's hands trembled. She felt the weight of everyone's eyes on her. The shame was becoming unbearable. Jake, the young man who had recognized Shaq earlier, stepped forward. "Mrs. Margaret," he said gently, "Shaq's done more for people in need than anyone I know. He's helped underprivileged kids, donated to schools, and even paid for funerals of people he didn't know. He's the kind of guy who deserves respect." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know," she repeated, but this time her voice was softer. The weight of her actions finally settled in her heart. Shaq looked at her kindly. "You didn't know, but now you do." The words hung in the air, simple but powerful. The crowd remained silent, watching for what would come next. Emma, sensing the tension was easing, spoke up. "Why don't we all take a moment and just breathe?" Margaret nodded numbly. She wanted to disappear, but Shaq wasn't finished. "Ma'am," he said, "you have a choice now. You can hold on to your anger, or you can let it go. We're all here to live together. We don't have to like each other, but we can respect each other." Margaret's lips trembled again. For the first time, she met Shaq's eyes directly, and what she saw there wasn't anger or judgment. It was empathy. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, but this time it was genuine. Shaq gave a small smile. "Apology accepted." The room seemed to release its collective breath. Some shoppers began clapping quietly, and the tension started to dissolve. Margaret, overwhelmed with emotion, turned and hurried out of the store. She needed time to process everything, but one thing was certain. Her life had just changed forever. Shaq watched her go. He hoped the encounter had planted a seed of understanding in her heart. Emma walked back to the counter, shaking her head. "You handled that better than most people would have." Shaq gave a modest shrug. "I've learned that fighting hate with hate doesn't get us anywhere." Jake stepped forward again. "Shaq, can I get a picture?" Shaq chuckled. "Sure, man." As Jake snapped the photo, other shoppers came forward too, grateful to meet a legend who had handled a difficult situation with grace and kindness. Margaret sat on the bench outside the grocery store, her hands trembling in her lap. The cool air bit at her skin, but she barely noticed. Shame and regret weighed on her like a heavy blanket. "What have I done?" she muttered to herself. Her thoughts swirled with confusion and sadness. For years, Margaret had clung to old beliefs, passed down from her family and reinforced by her small-town upbringing. But today, those beliefs had been cracked wide open by her own actions and by Shaq's grace. Inside the store, Shaq finished taking pictures with a few fans. The atmosphere had returned to normal, but he couldn't stop thinking about Margaret. He had seen the pain in her eyes before she left. "I should check on her," he said quietly to Emma, who nodded in understanding. Stepping outside, Shaq spotted Margaret on the bench. She looked fragile, her posture hunched and defeated. "Ma'am," Shaq said softly as he approached. "Mind if I sit down?" Margaret looked up, her eyes red-rimmed with tears. "You're too kind to me," she whispered. "After what I said, you should hate me." Shaq sat down beside her, giving her space, but staying close enough to show he cared. "I don't believe in hate," he said simply. "Hate doesn't solve anything." Margaret wiped at her eyes with a shaky hand. "I don't know why I said those awful things. I don't even know you." "That's the thing about prejudice," Shaq said gently. "It doesn't need a reason. It just hides inside us until something brings it out. But once we see it for what it is, we have the chance to change." Margaret nodded slowly. "I grew up hearing things like that all the time. It just became part of me. I didn't question it." She paused, her voice trembling. "But I see now that I was wrong. You didn't deserve that. Nobody does." Shaq smiled, a warm and genuine expression. "I appreciate you saying that. It takes courage to admit when we're wrong." Margaret took a deep breath. "I'm so sorry, Shaquille. Truly. I didn't mean to hurt you." Shaq placed a large hand over hers. "Apology accepted. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do next." Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her. Shaq's forgiveness wasn't just kind, it was healing. "I need to change," she said firmly. "I can't keep holding on to these old ways. I want to be better." Shaq nodded. "That's a good place to start." They sat in silence for a few moments, the tension replaced by a quiet peace. "Can I do anything to make it up to you?" Margaret asked. Shaq shook his head. "Just keep learning, and maybe spread a little kindness wherever you go." Margaret gave a small smile. "I'll do my best." As they stood up, a few shoppers passed by, nodding at Shaq with admiration. Margaret noticed how many people respected him, not just because of his fame, but because of his character. "Thank you for being patient with me," she said softly. Shaq gave her a gentle pat on the shoulder. "We're all human. It's never too late to grow." Margaret felt lighter as she walked away. She had a lot of work to do, but for the first time, she felt hopeful. Shaq watched her go, knowing that today had been a turning point, not just for her, but for everyone who witnessed it. The story of the grocery store confrontation spread quickly throughout the small town. By the end of the day, nearly everyone had heard about what happened, how Shaquille O'Neal had handled the situation with grace, and how Margaret had publicly apologized. At the local diner, a group of regulars sat around a table, discussing the event. "Can you believe it? Margaret actually apologized," said Jim, the owner of the hardware store. "I've known her for years and she's always been set in her ways." Emma, the young cashier from the store, nodded. "It was Shaq's kindness that changed her. He didn't react with anger. He just showed her another way." Meanwhile, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, pen in hand. She had been thinking all night about what Shaq said. "Spread a little kindness wherever you go," he had told her. She began to write, "Dear Shaquille, I want to thank you again for your kindness. You could have walked away, but instead, you gave me a chance to see my own flaws. I'm working on becoming a better person. Thank you for showing me what grace and understanding look like. Sincerely, Margaret." After sealing the letter, Margaret felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew words alone wouldn't be enough. She needed to take action. The next morning, Margaret visited the local community center. It was a place she had never been to before, a hub for activities that brought people from different backgrounds together. "I'd like to volunteer," Margaret told the director. "I want to help with anything you need." Over the next few weeks, Margaret became a familiar face at the center. She helped with after-school programs, organized food drives, and even attended workshops on diversity and understanding. Slowly but surely, she began to change. Word of Margaret's transformation spread. Those who had known her for years were surprised and inspired. One afternoon, Emma approached Margaret at the community center. "I just wanted to say, I'm proud of you. You've come a long way." Margaret smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. "Thank you, Emma. It's never too late to learn." Shaq, too, heard about Margaret's efforts. He received her letter and was moved by her sincerity. During a public speaking event at the community center, Shaq shared the story, anonymously, to highlight the power of empathy and forgiveness. "Sometimes," Shaq told the audience, "we're faced with ignorance and prejudice, but how we respond can make all the difference. Change starts with understanding and with kindness." The audience erupted in applause. Margaret, sitting in the back of the room, wiped a tear from her eye. She felt grateful for Shaq's forgiveness and determined to continue her journey of self-improvement. Months passed, and the small town continued to reflect on the lessons from Shaq and Margaret's story. The local community center had become a bustling hub of activities, and Margaret was now a regular volunteer. She had dedicated her time to bridging gaps between people of different backgrounds. One afternoon, a group of teenagers gathered at the center for a discussion on empathy and respect. Margaret, sitting quietly at the back of the room, listened as a young girl named Lisa shared her experience. "My family moved here 2 years ago," Lisa said. "At first it was hard. Some people didn't treat us kindly because we're different. But places like this center helped me feel like I belonged." Margaret's heart clenched. She thought back to her own actions that day in the grocery store and how easy it had been for her to judge. After the session ended, Margaret approached Lisa. "You're very brave for sharing your story," Margaret said with a kind smile. "I've learned that we all have things we need to work on. If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." Lisa smiled back. "Thank you, Mrs. Margaret." Meanwhile, Shaq continued using his platform to promote kindness and understanding. He often shared stories of hope and transformation during interviews and public appearances. One day, during an event at a nearby high school, he was asked about the grocery store incident. "How did you stay so calm when someone treated you unfairly?" a student asked. Shaq smiled. "I've learned that anger doesn't solve anything. Kindness has the power to change people. Margaret's a great example of that. She chose to grow and do better." The student nodded thoughtfully. Back in town, Margaret continued to make amends in her own way. She reached out to those she had once judged, taking the time to truly listen and understand their stories. Slowly, she became a respected member of the community, known not just for her volunteer work, but for her humility and willingness to change. One day, Shaq returned to town for another event at the community center. He spotted Margaret near the entrance and walked over to her. "Margaret," Shaq greeted warmly. "It's good to see you again." Margaret smiled nervously. "Thank you for coming back. I can't thank you enough for your kindness that day." Shaq shook his head. "You don't have to thank me. You did the hard work. I'm proud of you." The two shared a brief hug, and a nearby group of children clapped excitedly. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I'm just trying to be better, one day at a time." "That's all any of us can do," Shaq said, "and every step counts." Months after their meeting at the community center, Margaret had become a regular presence in the town's efforts to promote unity. She had made it her mission to foster understanding and break down barriers between people of different backgrounds. One sunny afternoon, the community center hosted a cultural fair. Families from all walks of life gathered to share food, stories, and music from their heritages. Margaret helped organize the event, ensuring everyone felt welcomed. She moved from booth to booth, listening to stories and learning about the diverse cultures represented in her small town. At one booth, Lisa, the young girl Margaret had befriended, offered her a plate of traditional food. "Mrs. Margaret, you should try this. It's my grandmother's recipe." Margaret accepted the plate with a smile. "Thank you, Lisa. It smells wonderful." She took a bite and gave an approving nod. "Delicious," Lisa beamed. "You've really changed, you know. My mom talks about how kind you've been at the center." Margaret's eyes softened. "Change is hard, but it's worth it. Meeting people like you and your family has taught me so much." Meanwhile, Shaq had been following the town's progress. He often spoke about his experience at the grocery store during interviews and events. His story became a symbol of the power of forgiveness and transformation. During a national television appearance, Shaq shared, "Margaret is proof that people can grow. She made a mistake, but instead of hiding, she chose to learn and make things right. That's a lesson we all need to remember." The town soon became known for its efforts to promote empathy and understanding. Inspired by Margaret's journey, many residents began volunteering at the community center and participating in discussions on inclusivity. One day, Shaq returned to town for a special event: the dedication of a new mural on the side of the community center. The mural depicted people of different backgrounds standing together, symbolizing unity and hope. Margaret stood beside Shaq as the mural was unveiled. The crowd erupted in applause, and tears welled in Margaret's eyes. "This is beautiful," Margaret whispered. "It's a reflection of the community," Shaq said. "You helped make this happen." Margaret shook her head. "I just played a small part. It's the people who chose to come together that made the difference." As the sun set, Margaret and Shaq shared a quiet moment, looking out at the town that had grown so much since their first encounter. "Thank you for believing in me, Shaq," Margaret said softly. Shaq smiled. "Everyone deserves a second chance, and you made the most of it." The town continued to thrive, and Margaret's story became a beacon of hope. It was a reminder that change is always possible, and that understanding and compassion can transform even the deepest divides. Guys, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this story. Let us know about your thoughts in the comments section. Also, subscribe the channel for daily stories notification.